So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiffany Griffin, and I head up the M&E and Strategic Analytics for the Center for Resilience at USAID. Welcome to this breakout on resilience measurement. As you may have noticed in your schedule, there are 2 sessions on measurement. So there is this breakout today, and then there's a plenary tomorrow. So in today's session, we'll really focus on the methodological advances that have occurred over the past 5 years with respect to capturing resilience, resilience dynamics, and resilience capacities. Tomorrow's plenary session will highlight some of our most compelling findings to date and then tie those findings very tightly to the methodological advances that generated that particular evidence. So today is very focused on methodology. We have 4 speakers today, spanning multiple organizations. What unites them all is that they've all been trailblazers with respect to the resilience measurement space. Each speaker will talk about a very distinct aspect of resilience measurement. It's important to keep in mind that while there's nuance for sure between perspectives, as an international development community, we've really coalesced around some unifying principles, and I think you'll be able to see what those principles are once we get through the presentations. Each speaker will go for about 7 to 10 minutes. Sharp. And at the end of the 4 presentations, we'll have an opportunity for dialogue and question and answers. I reserve the right to engage in the Q&A session as well, but I will not be giving a formal presentation. So we'll start with Marco De Rico. Did I pronounce it right?
Yes.
Lead econometrician at FAO, and then we'll turn to Tim Frankenberger, who is the president of Tango International. Third, we'll have Mark Constance, who is an associate professor at Cornell University. And then last but certainly not least, we'll have John Kurtz, who leads up the the research and learning portfolio at Mercy Corps. So go ahead, Michael. Yes.
Okay, good afternoon.
Hello. Yeah, hello. So, good afternoon, and as always, when I have to present about RIMA and econometrics is after lunch, so everybody more or less is trying to relax. So if someone wants to take a nap, I will not take it personally, okay? So you're allowed. And to make things even more complicated, after Tiffany originally said 10 minutes, I made a presentation of 16 slides, which is and to make things even more complicated, I'm consuming one of these 10 minutes selling these silly things. So I think that I will definitely start. Okay. Yeah, and things are more complicated by the screen of this. Okay, so as Tiffany was mentioning, we are quite a consistent community since the last many years. So we started really starting from the beginning, and more or less the first thing that we all of us agreed upon is the fact that resilience is one of the most influential concepts in development studies and projects, but at the same time has so many difficulties in first being defined in a proper and consistent way, and second being measured. More or less, we all build up on a shared definition, which is the one that I'm showing on the screen, the definition from the technical working group on resilience measurement. Resilience is the capacity that ensures adverse stressors and shocks do not have long-lasting consequences on development. As a community, we made a lot of progress in achieving a consistent definition and a consistent measurement for resilience. We did a lot of knowledge sharing, so including papers, including guidelines, which can be found on different websites, can be found in from different sources, and can set the scene for further development of the resilience analysis. We managed to achieve a certain degree of harmonization. We are investing a lot of efforts in gathering a common understanding of a measurement framework. We managed also to institutionalize resilience, including making sure that there may be happening things like including government, including National Bureau of Statistics, including different stakeholders, also following what Buffo was saying, including people directly in the field with which we have to design together a resilience framework for measuring resilience and to making sure that the projects are effective. And as a community of practice, we managed to share knowledge to arrive to a point where we can agree on certain things for starting and deepening our analysis and our knowledge of resilience. Just to make sure that we are all on the same scene, we can say that the resilience is not observable in nature. Of course, we cannot weight resilience directly. We cannot manage the resilience directly. We cannot buy resilience. We can say that resilience can be applied to various systems. So household resilience, community resilience, national resilience, and different sciences. Resilience is very much context specific, meaning that resilience is very much related to a specific area and much related to a specific shock. These are features which make measurement very, very complicated. It's very highly time dependent, which of course relates to our data, the data that we have, because resilience changes over time. If we don't have data, panel data or pseudo panel data, this limit very much our capacity of measuring resilience. And this relates also to the concept of the dynamic of resilience, how resilience changes over time, and whether, for example, a household can be reached by one shock in 5 years is something different if this household has been reached by 5 shocks in the same 5 years. And this is going to limit, of course, the capacity of the household to bouncing back to a previous result. More or less, there are different approaches for measuring resilience, but more or less, we tend to agree on around a concept that sees resilience as composed by components which are time variant, like in the case, sorry, it's really hard to see the screen here. Like in the case of the equation that I'm showing here, the A1 component is time invariant, the A2 component is time variant, and then we can have some X characteristics of the household plus some shocks. So more or less, this is how resilience can be defined. How do we measure resilience with this tool called RIMA, Resilience Index Measurement and Analysis, that we started in 2009 with, at FAO. We initially were only using latent variable models. At this stage in FAO, we measure resilience with a mixed approach, which includes both latent variable models and regression analysis. We can both use pre-existing data, like in the example of LSMS, or like in the example of the Kenya or the DHS surveys or other type of surveys already existing in the field. Or we can do data collection ourselves using questionnaires and using survey instruments. We initially were just on quantitative measure, and now we are including qualitative and quantitative measure. Likewise, we are integrating objective measures of resilience with subjective measures of resilience. There will be another session with Chris tomorrow on this. In the last version of RIMA, we are using shocks as exogenous to see how they affect, to what extent they affect resilience capacity of the household. Yeah. I will move directly here. This is our analytical framework, our conceptual framework, where we have 4 pillars: access to basic service, assets, adaptive capacity, and social safety nets. We have the shock. After the shock, there is the adoption of coping strategies, and then we have a new situation. Another way of seeing the bouncing back process of resilience is following the trajectory of food security indicators, like in this example. So we tend to follow the households who manage to who first receive the shock. So between time 1 and the shock, they can see their food security indicators decreasing, and then manage to recover. And we want to understand the major determinants of this recovery capacity. Some very quick case study. This is an example of data collection that we are doing in Karamoja, northern Uganda, together with the resilience measurement unit that we set up together with the UBOS, the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, and together with the Office of Prime Minister there. We have sampled different clusters of households that received a project of WFP, UNICEF, and FAO jointly, And we have sampled other households for obtaining control group and obtaining also direct and indirect spillover effect. And we will be able to see whether these projects has had an impact on resilience or not. Another example can be taken from these other case studies in Mauritania, where we have been using the resilience index as an indicator for targeting the different areas which can be more or less resilient, and getting to the level where we can understand why one region is more resilient than the other one. This is the same example with a different shape of slide to make sure that you are following correctly. And this is another example that can be seen how we can disaggregate the different components of resilience to measure which is the most relevant in determining the resilience capacity of a household. In this case, it is an example coming from a Jordan study that we are finalizing in these days with a different type of family according to their origin. Finally, my last slide is an example of the impact evaluation an impact evaluation of the joint resilience strategy in Somalia. This is related to a district which is called Dolo in the Gedo region in south-central Somalia. And in this case, we can follow the indicators of resilience to see whether the project that we are studying has had an impact, positive or negative, on the resilience capacity of the household. And I conclude here, and I hand this over to, it's 9 minutes, 14 seconds, 15, 16.
Thank you, Marco. Tim, do you want to go next?
Is there a clicker, or do I need to come up there?
You need to come up there.
Okay.
The screen is small.
Yeah, the screen is complicated to see. It's difficult to see the screen. Because it is too low with respect to the microphone.
What's that? I can just do this, right? Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Tim Frankenberger. I'm with Tango International. I'm going to be talking about some of the methods that we've been developing over the last several years to try to measure resilience. And I'm not going to go so much into the details about the findings. If you come to the plenary tomorrow, you'll get to see that. So this is just to kind of introduce you to the kinds of data collection activities that we engage in. One of the things that we don't need to continue to redefine, but resilience for us is where you see changes in indicators over time, particularly well-being indicators, during the course of a shock. So we were interested in whether or not they are going to be, wait a minute, this is not my presentation. This is the one from tomorrow. Okay. Whoa. I get to start over.
It's
You can restart.
okay. It's not in this folder, is it? It's not this, is it?
No,
Okay.
Want to use mine, Tim?
I'm not sure that
it
because this
should say Tango.
yeah, that's the one we
Mark,
have.
do you want to?
What you doing? I'll
Yeah. Do we have
yeah,
it?
I'll get it over here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
Use mine up there?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's just on this. We got something on there. Is this yours? This isn't yours. Okay, because Tim just said that.
But if you want, I can give mine once again.
Okay, Tim just said this isn't his, that this is yours. Okay.
Mark only has one, so we should.
I only have one.
Okay. There you
Our
go.
chair is abandoning us now.
Is that correct? Okay.
So we've been giving presentations, the
Very
four of
good.
us
So-
together many times. So we try
Okay.
to create
Yeah.
some improvisation.
Okay. Do we lose Tiffany? I'm not Tim Frankenberger. So
Thank God.
it's a big disclaimer. Let me begin with a preamble. I need to give some acknowledgments here. Related to the comments that I will offer this afternoon, some thanks or acknowledgments are in order. And this relates to the kind of work we've done, so it's not just a kind of a polite genuflection. I would first like to express my appreciation to the Food Security Information Network and colleagues at FAO and WFP who enabled the work of the Resilience Measurement Technical Working Group. And this is where the conceptual foundations and analytical principles on which much of today's resilience measurement work is broadly based. Secondly, work of the team who led the development and implementation of the study that generated the Malawi data are of course vital here. And at this point, Catholic Relief Services, our research partner, and James Campbell in particular in the field, the work they organize is critical. And as you'll see, what I'm talking about here is high frequency data collection, 12 rounds of consecutive monthly data. At Cornell, postdoc Nathan Jensen, who's now at ILRI, and a doctoral student, Erwin Nippenberg, who's in another session, assumed leadership for much of the field operations and helped explore an interesting array of analytical tools. So with that, I probably used most of my, in conclusion then, I can say, I think I have more time than that. I don't have a timer here, but I think I'm well timed. Building on some aspects of Marco's presentation, in particular, the definition of resilience offered in one of his slides, let me begin by stating the argument for taking a close look at what my talk is about. Really, it's taking a close look at shocks. So, in some ways, my talk, in a sense, is not about resilience. It's about a core component of the measurement resilience protocol. And I want to just introduce an argument for that before going into the meat of the talk. In most definitions of resilience that are in circulation, which are expressed, graphically, formulaically, or in text, shocks and stressors are features. And those of you who recall the original Diffid and Tango version with the star-like feature of the shock. And I think that this is important, and early interest in resilience was driven by the shared observation that defining features of the landscape of shocks and stressors had become more pronounced, more interconnected, and in some cases less predictable. So shocks indeed are at the core of resilience measurement, and therefore deserve close inspection and careful measurement. The focus of my talk is based on the premise that exploring how shocks are experienced and how they can be measured in a way that best reflects the realities of lived experience can, one, improve accuracy of measurement, maybe help nudge our R-squares and our ability to explain variation a bit, and generate evidence, and here is the practical part, generate evidence to improve targeting of resources and programs that are intended as a response to shocks and stressors. So my brief comments now, and some slides I have, I'll expand briefly on the motivation for the work, introduce the empirical study, and share some results that we have on trying to get closer to more precise shock metrics. So the rationale is that, indeed, shocks have to be a core part of resilience measurement. The motivation we have are both empirical and they're methodological. In the empirical case, here is what we know, is that shocks don't occur in little boxes. We may measure something like a drought, but a drought doesn't just live on its own. A drought produces productivity shocks on food, on agriculture. It then produces food security shocks, then possibly produces health shocks and so forth. So these shocks, which then, as others have written, also could produce political conflict shocks in a scarce economy. So shocks don't occur in boxes. So the multiplicity of shocks, the simultaneity of shocks, the interaction is critical, and we need to take that into closer account. Secondly, the methodological motivation for our work is the sensitivity to resilience. The focus and measurement of shocks is critical, as I've argued, and being able to measure those over time is also important. The work we're doing in Malawi, which you'll hear about in a moment, is we're trying to focus on higher and appropriate frequency and longer and more appropriate durations of data collection, so we consider rates of change, volatility, and durability over time. Many people, for example, have cited data or have studies that show that selling off of productive assets in the short run leads to short-term gains and then long-term suffering once those are lost. Also on the methodological side, we're aiming towards lower burden. Rather than having a household survey that lasts an hour and a half, we are doing monthly surveys that last 10 to 15 minutes over the course of the year. We're collecting about the same amount of data, but in shorter bursts. And it's programmatically integrated with CRS on the ground to maximize alignment and minimize attrition. As I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, the way we administer these, we work closely with the field staff, and we minimized attrition. We started off with a sample of about 580. In the first 6 months, we lost just 5%. We lost a little bit more because, in fact, we lost literally one of our numerators who died. But overall, the integration of data collection with the programmatic work as a methodological driver was key to the success of our work. So that's the shocks is the key focus of what we're doing here. The second part is thinking about the motivations, both empirical and methodological. And let me now just move on briefly to talk about the empirical study and the context. It was located in Malawi, in Chihuahua, and it was driven by a flood in 2015, which was then followed by a drought, integrated with Ubali, one of CRS's platforms on the ground here. I don't have a timer on here, do I? I have 4 minutes, good, okay, good. The Mirror Protocol, monthly low-burden cell phone-based surveys, 15-minute max, village level administered by local program staff, shock module, asset module, household characteristics module, and CSI reduced form. The focus on the shock module, we collected data on 15 shocks, binary in the first instance. We also tried to index those to well-being outcomes. And I'll go through quickly here with my 4 minutes and just give you some pictures of what we have here. The analysis of shocks, the resilience analysis, we want to just show you how you can look at them more closely, looking at the temporal properties of the shocks, distribution of single shocks over time, shock combinations, and the spatial properties of those shocks, and then conclude by talking about some of the benefits of doing that. The first slide here, we can look at the distribution of shocks going across the different shock variables and also over time. And I've circled some of the peaks within shocks, looking over time periods, and then the broad ellipse looks at shocks across, looks at the combination of shocks. I have it here now because we're going to unpack this using multidimensional, using MCA. Got a blank on the name now. Marco.
What?
MCA.
Multiple.
Correspondence analysis. Thank you. Sorry, I blanked on it in the rush of time. We're using multiple correspondence analysis, which is a way of dealing, kind of like a way of dealing with categorical data in a PCA-like format. We also then looked at shock combinations. Now, what I want to say, just flipping back and forth quickly between these first two, these are what I would call aesthetically appealing, though analytically vacuous. There's not much you can do with these things and say, this looks nice. And you can use it, this one in particular, you use what I would call a Monet method, which is you squint and you look for the form and the shape and say, something appears to be going on there. So going forward here, what we did is we looked at shock combinations and tried to see which ones occurred most frequently with each other. And I have to tell you, this is very preliminary data, meaning it's there are some fine-tuning that we need to do. But generally, we have 2 dimensions here which account for the variation in the shocks. And the other thing I want to say here is that we're dealing with a massive amount of data here. We stacked the data, it's atemporal at the moment, all the way to the end period. So it's 12 rounds times 15 shocks times roughly 500 observations. We're dealing with about 90,000 to 100,000 data points here. And trying to leverage that, understand how the data is the kind of gravitational center and how certain kinds of shocks appear to hang together. The one to look at, understanding that the first dimension sucks up most of the variance in this kind of modeling, is that that job loss and wind and theft is the best fit for the first dimension. Whoop, I got that backwards, actually, it's the other way around. Sorry, the end of assistance, food shocks and livestock is the one that sucks up the most, and then I have to flip those, apologies for that. And the job loss, wind and theft are best for the second, and then the compromised one are the other 2. So, 1 minute or 2? How many? 1 minute, okay. So let me go to my, I won't speak to this now other than say that we're also trying to explore the spatial variation and concentration across the 3 traditional authorities that we looked at for these, for the same kind of mapping. Let me conclude then just saying what the opportunity is here. And I see 4 opportunities to improve resilience measurement. The first is to measure how shocks and stresses interact and the need for a multidimensional shock index. The second is to examine temporal aspects of shocks and stressors, persistent effects, and looking at shock propagation effects, how one shock leads to another shock. And the third is to model interactions and cumulative effect, sensitivity to temporal dynamics and shock combinations. And 4, applying analytical techniques to exploit data density. This number is lower than the one I just mentioned. The one I mentioned is correct. And I think this leads to a better understanding of shock dynamics that we can bring into our resilience analysis and eventually better evidence for targeting and decision making. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So now we're going to go to John, who will also be emphasizing shocks.
Back of the bus.
Tim got bumped. Actually, what I wanted to do was, first recognize the strides we've made last 5 years. The kind of models that Mark and Mark are presenting, it's just a tip of the iceberg. There's tons of you all that have equally sophisticated and really relevant approaches to trying to figure out this concept and what we do with it. What I wanted to do is step back a little bit and just take stock of if we're actually going in the right direction. And there's a couple of sort of things that have kept me up at night and wondering, are we really using the right kinds of tools and methods to get at this? And I have a great picture that is struggling to get up here. And it really is around two areas. One is around how we're going about analyzing resilience dynamics. And the second one is much more around the data that we're putting into that analysis and where it comes from.
I'm sorry, it's free. Okay.
There you go. All right. Is it up there?
Yep, it's up there.
Super. Okay. So sometimes it feels a bit like this woman, that we're out there mowing the grass, but potentially the wrong tool. One thing that we all agree on is that resilience is a messy concept. It comes from fields that are, really emphasize nonlinear dynamics. So we all recognize it's, as a trajectory is not straightforward, and then the relationships that underlie it are also not straightforward. But it seems like a lot of our approaches, and all of these critiques are sort of self-referential as well. My stuff, first and foremost, really has tried to simplify resilience. But in doing so, we might have kind of reduced some of the unique aspects of it into a more linear form than may be useful. So I wanted to walk through first an example of where we've recognized that and tried to push slightly beyond that as just a way to open a conversation on how are people looking at resilience in ways that reflect potential nonlinear relationships. So I'll do that through an impact evaluation that we did in Ethiopia that was led by my colleague Brad Segara. So any strengths and limitations here are directed at him. This was a program, one that's been mentioned, where a long-term resilience investment in eastern Ethiopia, through a number of studies, including this one, we're able to see some pretty positive effects on resilience, especially in the recent El Nino-related drought there. So what's interesting is less of the findings and more of, I think, what they tell us and where we need to go to find them. The first question that we looked at was just simply, did the program work for resilience? It's not that straightforward, but in terms of how we looked at it, it actually is pretty simple. Just looking at a treatment effect, in this case, of a comparison group, and against those that we programmed with. On an outcome in this case, this is indicative of kind of what we saw for household hunger, but obviously looked at a bunch of other things. We looked at this in the first instance as just a flat effect, right? So regardless of how much you were affected by the drought, and we've got this scale here of precipitation, what was the program effect? And you get, in this case, a negligible result. So fine, it didn't really make a difference to household hunger at any point of drought severity. So that is sort of overly simplistic, but I think pushed us to what we have seen elsewhere, including Tim's analyses and many others, to look at, is the program more effective as, in this case, the drought gets worse? Because that is sort of the theory underlying resilience, right? So this is just the next step in the modeling, which is an interaction. So you look at the treatment and you look at allow it to sort of look at each level of drought severity and see if the program was effective, more effective as that went up. So here we got a cool result, and we've seen this elsewhere, that for those households affected worse, the program was more effective in terms of reducing household hunger. And this one is great. We're happy with this. We think it does reflect the reality. We saw similar things with livestock deaths, and Tim can share others. But when we looked at this too, we weren't quite satisfied, because it sort of implies that this program is going to continue to be effective indefinitely into the most severe drought that one could imagine, right? That line continues on, had there been, drought that was even more severe. And it sort of gave us pause because it's not the way we think things work, right? That's probably unlikely that the program is going to continue to work even on a 100-year drought. So here, Brad and others came up with seems like a fairly standard approach to other analyses where we know that nonlinearity is an issue, and went after a question which is really trying to understand either a threshold or sort of a point to which the program was effective, and then where it might have tapered off. So here, I'll say they because it really wasn't me. I could just get to present on it. Was another model, in this case, looking at the shock, but as a quadratic. And again, Brad can sort of give you the specifics behind it. But what this does is it allows us to understand program effects at different levels, and it doesn't have to be a straight line through those. So what this told us is a little bit more intuitive, which is, the program actually at sort of normal levels really didn't have an effect at all on household hunger. For those households where they were moderately to severely hit, the program was most effective, but after that point, the program's ability to support households to maintain food security tapered off by the time it became an extreme drought. Which, talking to the program team in the field, they said, yeah, that's how we would think it would have worked. So this one for us was best fit in multiple ways, and we feel like reflects a little bit more true to the concept of resilience, but also from an analysis perspective, where we might want to be going forward with these, both from an evaluation perspective, but also as we look at some of these analyses of what explains resilience to certain shocks. We think there's probably similar relationships going on there. What am I doing? Perfect. Okay. So moving into data collection, we recognize that resilience is as well as data hungry, right? We say, we want more data, we want it to be panel and high frequency and full of all these good things that Mark presented. And most of the people we work with in the field are sort of saying, actually, we really want just a simplified version of this because we can't make sense of what we have. So thinking about how, and look, the applications of some of these high frequency data collection analysis studies, which again, Tim will present a little bit more on, have taken us leaps and bounds in terms of understanding resilience much better. So I'm not advocating let's go back to our one-off cross sections. But I think in order to get beyond where we are in a way that doesn't continue to produce kids like this that hate us, we need to think about how to step back and get data on some of these key variables in different ways. So turns out there's this thing called the cell phone. And interestingly, the way that, so we're working with some researchers at Feinstein as well as a group called FlowMinder to do not what is certainly an advancement, which is mobile data collection, send a survey versus going out and knocking on doors. But in this case, and this may not be new to other of you who are more technologically savvy than me, what we're doing is looking at trying to pull call detail records from phones, which capture things like how long you talked, how much money you used to top up, what the structure of your calling network is, your mobility based on cell tower coverage. And it turns out all these things are really strong predictors of socioeconomic status. So there's all this sort of data out there, especially in countries where cell phones are pretty common, that can tell us things around a core part of resilience measurement. And I'll walk through kind of where we're trying to go with that. But just as an example of this, of where we're coming from and where this could take us, just in terms of looking at something like poverty. So this is kind of our lowest level of disaggregation and this is Nigeria, I think from LSMS 2011 or so. So great, at a state level, somebody correct me if that's wrong, understanding poverty dynamics in a place through looking at call detail records in combination with household survey data. Groups like FlowMinders and others are able to produce these maps that are quite highly resolved in terms of understanding differences in poverty, down to what it is a 1 kilometer squared resolution, right? So understanding at that level how poverty differs over time based on, if you think of cell phone data records, the frequency is more than we could ever collect by hand. So getting back to applications for us, if we look at an intervention area, time's up. Okay. We're able to go in at a household level and find food security status over time, or fill in the proxy indicator. And right now we're trying to validate that against high frequency data that we have collected by hand in a few places in Nepal. And what that allows us to do, once you throw in shocks and all the other data that we have access to, especially existing sources, is potentially leapfrog what we're doing now in terms of even mobile data collection, and really be able to look at something both spatially and temporally that currently isn't possible. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So while Tim gets support on loading his presentation, I'm just going to that was a lot of information. And I'm looking around the room and I'm getting like a little energy of being overwhelmed. So I thought I would distill some kind of high-level take-homes with respect to the first 3 presentations, and then we'll have Tim and some Q&A, and I can do the same thing for Tim. So, some of the things that kind of rose to the top with respect to Marco's presentation, you talked about harmonization, and I think that's a really important point, and it's important to distinguish harmonization from alignment. So I think in the earlier days of resilience measurement, there was a very strong drive to either have one model of resilience measurement or an aligned model. And now we're at the point where there can be differences, and we're kind of harmonizing around some key principles. Are you ready already? Are you ready?
I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. No. I'll talk later. It's more important. I have more points, but we can go to Tim.
I'll go over here.
Go ahead.
No, you were about to make a good point.
I have tons of good points, but we'll let's get your presentation and I'll summarize it.
All right.
I'm saying she has only one good point.
So I'm probably the only presenter gets to go twice, Anyway, what I was trying to say was we're going to talk a little bit about some of these approaches that we've been using in the last 5 years that we think have generated a lot of good data. But a lot of the results that came from these approaches you'll see tomorrow when you come to the plenary. Uh-oh. Not.
That's a subtraction.
Huh? I tell you. Maybe you guys don't really want to hear this. Okay, one of the things that we've been trying to do is we're trying to look at the difference between measuring resilience and resilience capacities. And for us, you have to measure a well-being indicator over time, how it responds to a particular shock. And so what we've been looking at is food security and whether food security has been maintained in terms of stable over time in the face of shocks, or whether you had quick recovery on that. We want to separate it out from resilience capacities, because resilience capacities are the things that enable people to manage those shocks and stresses. But if you heard some of the talk this morning, it's important to differentiate between capacities and actual responses. Capacities are basically a necessary but not sufficient condition. How people actually respond is what's key. You can have 2 people with exactly the same capacities, but they may respond completely differently for different reasons. So you need to make sure that you collect data on both. The other thing that's important is we collect information on capacities looking at what we call absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. Absorptive capacity for us is basically your ability to manage shocks and stresses in the short time, your kind of preventive measures that you actually put in place. Adaptive capacity recognizes that change is here for good, and you need to actually make a change in what you do to be able to manage it. It comes more out of the climate change work. And then transformative capacity is where we are actually looking at the enabling conditions, the factors that, the institutional factors, the policies, the infrastructure, the services that are in place, the normative practices that exist in a culture that have an effect on what decisions people make. So a lot of this absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities, we've identified different components that then you get indicators for, and you create these indices using factor analysis. We use both quantitative and qualitative techniques, and I think it's really important to use mixed method approaches. One of the things that we've been encouraged by is the World Bank. I enjoyed Stefan's talk this morning, but what's important for me is I'm not sure that they actually use the qualitative data that they collect effectively in these analysis, and we have found that the qualitative data is extremely important for being able to interpret the quantitative data that you're actually collecting. So we want to emphasize that you need both. You also need questionnaires that not only get at household data, but also community level data, so that you can actually see what kinds of institutions, services are being provided to the community that a household would have available to it, but maybe not necessarily access. The other thing that's important here is that we want to emphasize the panel data, that we are using panel data over time. We collect baseline data, and then every round of data that we collect after that is using a subset of that data set. And then in the end line, we'll try to find as many households as we can at the end. What's important here is that we're looking at shocks, people's capacities in the face of those shocks, and the outcome measures over time. And we try to complement that data with relevant community and household data on characteristics. What makes them vulnerable, or what are their key characteristics that might explain some of these outcomes? The other thing that's important too is that you try to use as much secondary data as you can to inform what you're looking at in terms of your primary data. So we would try to, I want to emphasize why it's not necessary to go back and collect primary data every time that you want to do one of these kinds of analysis. Now, one approach that we've been using is what we call the recurrent monitoring survey. And the recurrent monitoring survey basically tracks households every 2 months after a shock hits to see how the households are actually responding to those shocks. Not only the initial shock, it might be a drought, but the downstream effects of those shocks. So did the shock lead to livestock diseases, or did it lead to price hikes in the market? Do you start to see migration of people out of the area into other people's lands where you start seeing conflict going up? So these shocks are connected to each other, much like Mark was talking about earlier. The advantage of this is that we get to see in real time how households are actually responding to these shocks and stresses. What kinds of coping strategies are they using? Are they turning to negative coping strategies, or are some households actually able to manage these shocks better than others? Is it? I don't know why it keeps blinking. So the advantage of a recurrent monitoring survey is that it's real-time data collection following a particular shock trigger, and we rely on information from FuseNet, from satellite imagery, from early warning systems that the country may have, or early warning systems that the project may have set up. We want to emphasize that you need high-frequency data collection, but you don't need the full survey instrument that you did in the baseline. You're doing a subset because you already got that data from the baseline, and so you have smaller sample sizes that you're actually tracking. Now, one of the advantages of the RMS is that it allows you to determine what are the optimal points for launching an early action response, like a crisis modifier that was talked about this morning. It also allows you to see whether or not your interventions are actually making a difference in allowing people to manage these shocks better. The thing that we've done now, we've done these RMSs in Ethiopia. We've done 2 rounds in the prime project area for Ethiopia. We've just launched one in Bangladesh, and we are going to launch one in Niger and Burkina Faso. So we're going to have some of these recurrent monitoring systems set up in multiple countries. Somalia, oh yeah, Somalia as well, sorry. Did I leave that out? Sorry. The other thing that's important is we are taking data sets that we've already collected information on and going into a deeper dive. So we want to know, for example, are there certain households, what we normally would call positive deviants? Are they able to manage these shocks and stresses and maintain their food security over time better than other households? And why do they manage those things better? So using a positive deviant analysis, we can figure out whether or not certain resilience capacities that those households have are allowing them to manage those shocks better. Now, the advantage of using kind of a triangulation on your data analysis is that the positive deviant analysis basically allows you to see why certain deviants are doing better than others, but the growth regression equations also give you a pretty good insight about what's happening. So you want to use a combination of approaches to see if they're all pointing in the same direction. The other thing that we've been doing is that we've been taking existing data sets. For example, the data set that was collected by Food for Peace in Bangladesh, the Shaharda 2 project. It was not originally analyzed from a resilience lens, but we used a resilience lens in our resilience framework, and we re-looked at the data, and we were able to find that women's empowerment was one of the major capacities that actually enabled those women to manage that flood in 2014. So we recognize now that we need a good measure of women's empowerment for this kind of work. The other thing that we've done is we've looked at the LSMS data in Malawi, and we've also looked at the ZIMBAC data in Zimbabwe. And what we're finding is that you can actually learn a lot from going back and re-looking at these data sets. FAO has been doing this for a long time too, with multiple LSMS data sets in different countries. So instead of going out and collecting primary data all the time, we think that you can take existing data and really learn a lot about resilience in those places. I'm done.
Okay, so I'm just going to take about 2 minutes to extract some high-level themes that came out of those great but somewhat dense presentations. Some of them are observations, some of them are reactions, some of them are kind of high-level take-homes that I want to make sure folks kind of leave the room with. So going back to Matko's presentation, he talked about the, latent concepts. So latent concepts are concepts that you kind of can't touch, right? An asset, you know you have $1 or not. Motivation, identity, self-esteem. These are concepts that are intangible, but can be measured, and there are whole disciplines that do so. So I encourage us to pull from those disciplines rather than kind of recreating the wheel or struggling as much as I think we have struggled as a field with capturing resilience, given that it's kind of one of those intangible concepts. For folks going to the psychosocial factors panel tomorrow, I think we'll hear from some colleagues on how they've grappled with that dimension of intangibility, but it encompasses the concept of resilience itself. The other thing is, and we heard about shocks across multiple presentations. We tease our fearless leader about his term, complex risk environments in which we work. If anyone's ever talked to Greg Collins, and you know you've heard him say that. But it does characterize the context in which we work. These risks are not happening in isolation from each other. And so, you know, Mark talked and Tim talked about different measurement approaches for capturing the interrelationship of shocks. And then once you capture kind of how these shocks are hanging together, we need to go the next step to not have it just be descriptive, but to then use it to be predictive, right? If these combinations of shocks occur in these types of households, how do we best build resilience in those given different permutations of shocks? I want to caution us in the context of making comparisons across contexts or populations. So I know there's often a question like who's more resilient, right? Or what household is more resilient, or what area is more resilient. When doing so, we should always keep in mind that shock severity needs to be measured. And unless shock severity is held constant, that question, I would argue is kind of null. That you shouldn't be comparing contexts or populations or households or communities unless you can say that they've experienced the same level of shock. Otherwise, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges. I was struck this morning by one of Katie's points around it being extremely difficult to isolate program impacts in the face of a shock. I completely concur, and I think in conjunction between this presentation or this panel and tomorrow's plenary, you'll see how we've developed an approach to do so. It's the RMS, connecting the RMS to program impacts. And when you combine those two together, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's relatively low burden, and it does generate, at least from our perspective, some pretty compelling evidence around whether you're doing what you're hoping to do. Two other things, it didn't come up, so I want to bring it up, and that's this notion of contrasting whether you're having a positive impact and whether you're building resilience. And I think from a measurement perspective, we're not there yet in terms of at a project level on the ground, we may be doing really great things. Chances are we are. Whether we're always building resilience is another question, and methodologically it's a very difficult question, particularly given the time horizons that we're forced to show impact. So we say, we talk the game of resilience being a 20-year game, and we measure impacts in 3-year or 5-year increments. Do we have the right proxy indicators for building resilience in the short term? I'm not sure we're there. I think we use long-term impacts and then make conclusions accordingly when I think we have our time horizons off. So I'm going to stop there. We have about 10 minutes because we started late, so I'm going to say 10 minutes for questions and answers. Do folks have reactions, reflections, questions about anything that was discussed in this panel? Yes, Stefan.
So I had a question about this idea of having the shock somewhat constant. Thank you. Some of the interventions we do increase resilience up to a certain level of shock, and then can be useless or even make things worse. So in a typical example, if you build a dike up to a certain level, it removes all of the flood up to a certain level, but if it overtops and breaks, you multiply by 10 the losses from the shock. So, I mean, keeping the shock constant is good, but the question is where? And for the type of interventions we're doing, are we talking about the type of things that come back every 10 years? Or do we want to make communities resistant to the 100-year event or the 1,000-year event? So I think what's difficult to measure, it's also because we don't have that definition on which we all agree, and that for the choice of what you will be using as the shock you use to stress test your communities will completely change the type of interventions you want to do. And that we never found a good way around this problem, that focusing on the very frequent floods in cities might make them super vulnerable to a big shock. And that's the risk of our interventions. I don't know how you manage that.
Do we want to take a couple? Do we have other? Chris, and then Daniele?
Yeah, Chris Benet from... Chris Benet, okay. Doesn't matter from where. Two comments, actually. I think I really like the fact that two of the presentation were emphasizing the importance of better understanding shocks. The only things that, because as we know now, one of the principles of resilience measurement is effectively to understand shocks. Without shocks, we can't talk about resilience. One point, though, that I think was probably not, or maybe lost in the equation, I don't know, was the fact that beyond the severity of shocks, a very, very important dimension is the frequency. Yeah. And what actually empirical study shows is that for most of those people, at least in low-income countries, they are in a constant state of recovery. On average, they are hit by a very severe shock every 16 months, which means that even if we are effective as building back their capacities to recover, and they would probably recover if they were not hit again by another type of shocks, even before they can. So I think it will also, there's a need for us to move away from the simplistic linear model where we have the shock, we have the recovery, and then we measure. Because effectively what we have, as I said, is a constant state of recovery, and they don't move out of that point. The second comment is, again, along those principles of measurement. So we know that we need to understand the shock. I think Tim did a good job as reminding us the importance of understanding the different dimensions of capacities and measuring the well-being outcome at the end. But I think he also mentioned, and I think I want to re-emphasize what Tiffany says, is beyond those three elements, we also need to understand the response that people put in place and the decision-making process around those responses. Because what people decide to do in the aftermath of the shock is fundamental for us if we want to help them actually recover in a proper way. So that decision-making process around the shocks is, I think, something that we really need to emphasize as a key principle in our resilience measurement.
Danielle.
Thank you for all your presentations. Daniele Giovannucci from the Committee on Sustainability Assessment. I have a question, and it isn't so much about methodology, though I completely appreciate all the challenges you're facing and how important it is to get these right at the macro level particularly. But I think we can agree pretty clearly that a lot of the resilience issues are very much localized. So they're context specific, and they change on a dime, right? So they're going to be different this week than they were last week, literally. So apart from the overall policy prescriptions and the approaches that can come out of this, my question is less about methodology and more about mechanism. Are there approaches, including the work with cell phones and others, that can help localize, change the focal point, change the power, if you will, of the data and the decisions that come from the data to be more in the project, in the community, ideally, in local government, and in the place where it actually occurs, to permit decision-making and the faster response in real time? We have the ability to get data much faster now, right? We're not waiting 3 years as much as we need panel data and all the longitudinal approaches, which are absolutely critical. So I'm not saying don't do that. Absolutely we should. But is there a way to also begin to operationalize this work in a more, if you will, democratized way for local communities and for projects, supply chains, local government to take advantage of the data as it comes in, to take decisions when they're needed, not just learn about them looking backwards. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we're going to answer this round, and then we'll do another round, one last round of questions. Just one quick point on the longitudinal. The longitudinal work need not be long time windows. So you can do high frequency work in 3 months, right? So I just want to disentangle that. But do folks want to, we heard the train, so, right? But do folks want to respond to any of the questions that arose?
I can start with some reaction. Very interesting questions on shocks, and I think they are touching on aspects of the resilience analysis that we have not yet completely clear. It is true that when an intervention can be addressing one specific shock, it can be creating a problem with respect to the other shock. That's the context specificity of both the resilience analysis and the resilience analysis specific to one specific shock. So it's very complicated to me already understanding how resilience with respect to a specific shock can change. Adding another multidimensional aspect of the correlation between the change with respect to drought, say, and how it affects the resilience with respect to flood, it's overcomplicated in our analysis. I think Lisa and I can talk about this for decades without reaching to a final point. Now, because it's very complicated. I'm not saying that it's not valid. It's very valid. It's the inner nature of resilience which makes things more complicated to me. And in terms of severity and frequency, I strongly agree, Chris, of course. As I was mentioning, if it is one thing if you're reached by one shock in 5 years, another thing if you're being reached by 5 shocks in 5 years. And this makes me think to two important aspects. One, that we need to understand very well the relationship between consumption versus asset smoothing, because if someone is reducing the consumption for resisting to shock but don't sell out the assets, can be then able to recover. But maybe if I sell my tractor, I may not be able to buy it again. So once again, and the second point is on the need of rapid assessment tools that can help us monitoring the situation ongoing. And this takes me to another discussion that we were having this morning, Mark, about the relationship between data and evidence, no? Because we need to collect some data. In some cases now after 5 years of our collaboration, we have data, and now we need to understand better the evidence, what they are telling us. So we need to start the real analysis. I think this is more a reaction to your reaction than a proper answer, but
Tim?
Yeah, I think, that's kind of it's a circle. Like if you solve this shock problem, it's going to create another shock problem. If you solve that one, it's going to create another one. I think we could get lost in that kind of a circular reasoning. I think we need to be clear that we want to do no harm with the best knowledge that we have. And what we try to do is we try to analyze as many of the shocks as that we can capture. And we know that there's a relationship between these shocks, that one can create the others downstream, which could be a problem that it's very difficult for the household to actually manage. So we're trying to also look at, by looking at this data over time, what kinds of capacities do people actually use first to deal with the initial shocks? What ones do they use second, third, fourth, so you can actually understand their own sequential thinking around what they want to do in managing these shocks. But I think if you don't look at the combination, if you try to look at it one shock at a time, you could make some very big mistakes. So that's why we try very hard to look at the range of shocks that people are exposed to and the downstream effects of those shocks. So I think we're getting more sophisticated in our understanding of this, both subjectively and objectively. We're trying to measure these things both ways because we know that subjective understanding of the shocks you're exposed to have a lot to do with your response. If you don't think you're exposed to a drought, you won't act like you were exposed to a drought. And we know that that's been the case in places like Niger. I think work that the World Food Program did there actually shows that if people don't think they're actually in a drought, they won't take action to actually manage the drought, and it can be a problem later. So I think we're trying very hard to do that.
Okay, I'm just gonna, and I actually want to clear, when I said keep the shock constant, I didn't mean on the ground, like trying to keep shocks isolated from each other. I meant in the interpretation of your analysis. And so I'll give you a great example from Prime. We collected data in 2 regions, Borena and Jijiga. There was a very stark difference in the severity and the frequency of the shock, in this case drought, exposure in those 2 contexts. And people wanted to say, oh, people in Jijiga are more resilient than people in Borena. That's not a right interpretation of the data, because in Borena they experienced 3 droughts back to back to back, and it was more severe in this time frame that we looked at. So to say, oh, these people were more resilient because they have higher food security at the end of a year is a misinterpretation from an analytical perspective, not on the ground we can keep drought from preventing, from turning into flood and so on and so forth. We're out of time. We will stay here for 10 minutes, right, panel? Thank you. To answer folks' questions and to continue the dialogue. And sorry for the technological snafus. Yeah.
Just, I need to say,
we can't hear. Come up here. Can we
come up here?
Can we handle a microphone?
Folks who want to stay.
Here, you want to use the microphone? Here.
That's the first time I've even seen a peak of
I can't get it out.
the representation of the data you guys are collecting. We're planning on keeping PhD students busy for like the next 5 years.
Yeah, that's right. I expect one data set.
I know you're right.
That's just a shock data. We got 10,000 data points like just for the shock.
Oh, that's great. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's kind of.
And you guys are doing it all mobile, so that's like, seems like a lot.